All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Abdulrahim. I'm from University of Bahrain. I am not a computational linguist. I have to start with this, but I'm a corpus linguist and a semanticist, a constructionist in particular. So I really am happy to be here, and I'm glad to hear all the great work that's being put into building these corpora that I would eventually, and people like me would love to use to analyze language. And so what I'm presenting today is basically, you take away from it what you think is most useful for you. But basically how we can take some data, corpus data, and we can analyze it statistically to find the different patterns and possibly the rules for a rule-based kind of analysis. And so this is an outline of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'll talk about what motivates this kind of analysis, the phenomenon of near synonymy of motion verbs, basically come and go verbs in modern standard Arabic, and very briefly talk about the constructionist framework that I work within, and what would be the methodological approach that I'm using, just taking corpus data, annotating it for various kinds of constructional features, and eventually talk about the statistical test. I wrote a bunch of them in my paper, but I will be specifically talking about polytomous logistic regression analysis. And so this is what kind of started this whole research. We have in modern standard Arabic a bunch of verbs that mean come and a bunch of verbs that mean go. There's probably even more than ata, jaa, hadara, qadima, but I had to limit myself to these 4 verbs of come that don't really encode any kind of path of motion or manner of motion or possibly some kind of prosody. So aqbala is possibly a verb that involves some kind of coming, but it has some kind of positive semantic prosody. So I had to avoid verbs like that and just stick to verbs with specifically, the lexical semantics of motion verbs. And the same goes for go verbs. So I picked dhahaba, mada, raha, even though the last one is highly grammaticalized in modern standard Arabic. But it was an interesting choice for this talk. So the research. Basically, the verbs within each set are interchangeable in context where you have physical motion event. So, for example, you have ذهب أو مضى أو راح الأب إلى مركز الشرطة. Possibly راح is not as felicitous as the other ones in MSA, but you still find when you're looking at a corpus, you still find examples of verb usage like that. And the same goes for verbs of coming here. We accept all 4 of them as interchangeable in that very highly specifically physical motion event. However, once you start tweaking the contextual features, you're changing tense, aspect, subject, colloquy, for instance, other verb, word collocates, then you start having selectional restrictions, right? For example, it's okay to say لم يأتي الأب إلى مركز الشرطة، لم يحضر الأب إلى مركز الشرطة to denote the father did not come to the police station. But I think most of you would agree with me that لم يجئ الأب إلى مركز الشرطة might sound a little bit weird, yeah? لم يقدم, possibly. Then we kind of change from al-ab into رغبته as the subject colloquy here, and that kind of straight away rules out حضر or قدم. So أتت رغبته, جاءت رغبته. So we see here that the verbs are interchangeable in some contexts, but not in other contexts. So my point was to look at what actually triggers all these selectional restrictions for these 7 motion verbs. For a constructionist framework, basically we believe that the behavior of a lexical item is best understood, of course, in the context of usage and not in isolation. And this is an idea that's been promoted a lot in linguistics by Firth and subsequent, researchers. And so for a constructionist linguist, this motivates the analysis that we do in that we would like to, examine the entire lexicosyntactic frame. And what does that involve? Look at the syntactic structures a certain lexical item appears in, morphological inflections, other lexical items, other collocates basically that co-occur with it. And so all of that kind of, constitutes the constructionist framework. People now are probably adding gesture as part of, the constructionist, the whole construction. Phonology is possibly also another, reduction of, sounds, verbs, grammaticalized items. All of that is kind of blending into what our understanding of a construction is in linguistics. And so what I basically did is I constructed a data frame for every one of the 7 verbs of motion that I have here. And I applied the kind of analysis that Stefan Gries and his co-authors and Antti Arpe have been doing, and annotated, even though manually, I have to say, for a large number of annotating at a large number of concordance lines. I picked 500 of them for each verb for a very extensive set of linguistic features, and then we run statistical tests to kind of identify patterns of usage for each verb. My data is from Arabic corpus. It's not annotated. It's at the time of the data collection, that was quite a while ago. It was around 70 million. I think currently it's 70 million words almost. At the time it was even less. It consisted mostly of newspaper articles and had some modern literature and nonfiction, and also a bit of spoken Arabic. But these are the 3 components of Arabic corpus that I picked to extract my MSA data. And then for each one of these verbs, I've picked 500 random concordance lines, which made us end up with 3,500 line for the entire data frame for come and go verbs. So the data, the annotation, sorry, I have a kind of a typo with nil here, should be with 1 L. But basically the kind of annotation that I did was on an Excel sheet. So take each concordance line, line, and annotate it for verb morphology, syntactic transitivity, subject properties. So for example, sentential subject category. So for example, I had to look at whether the subject is human, is it an event, is it an object, an artifact, state, time, so all kind of, analysis, semantic categories. And then I also annotated the data frame, which was very interesting for me because I'm also a cognitive linguist. I'm also interested in looking at metaphorical extensions of verb uses. For the phrasal semantic categories, in an emotion event, is there an inclusion of goal? He came to the house, for example. An inclusion of source, he came from Palestine, or, manner, he came running, all of these things. Temporal, like whether there's a mention of time, purpose, etc. So all of these kind of ended up with 40 factors altogether. In the annotation of my data frame. And this is just an example of how a data frame was annotated. This is just a very small subset of the variables that I annotated it for. This is just one example. This is the idea that had almost disappeared from people's minds. And so we have the verb, which tense is it, what is the morphological aspect or mood, subject, number, gender, category, whether we have a source or goal, etc. And of course, a bunch of other variables. Now, for the statistical tests that I ran a bunch of statistical tests. If you're interested, I can link you to my dissertation on come and go verbs in modern standard Arabic. But for the purpose of this paper, I've specifically spelled out my analysis using chi-square tests and cluster analysis. These are very interesting in their own rights, just to kind of look at the distributional facts about these verbs. So for instance, looking at the variables that we have here, just looking at or just running simple chi-square tests, we can see that each verb differs with respect to tense. Which verb appears mostly in the present, which verb appears mostly in the past, and so forth. And so that gives us kind of a very first glance into the kind of distributional patterns that we get with each verb, the kind of contextual preferences, if you may, that each verb has. Cluster analysis would also help us find out which verbs look more alike in usage as opposed to which verbs that do not look alike in their usage. And again, just for the interest of time, I'm going to be talking most about polytomous logistic regression analysis, but feel free to ask me about the other ones if that sounds interesting to you at all. So, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with logistic regression analysis, but when we're talking about polytomous logistic regression analysis, we're talking about having more than one possible outcome. Okay, and so that works with the kind of analysis that I'm doing here on near synonymous verbs of motion. So they roughly have the same meaning, but then we would like to see how different they are or what kind of distinguishes them. Now, I'll be talking from now on about how we could, or what are the benefits, how we could run a logistic regression analysis and what are the benefits that we get out of it. And so, in order to start doing polytomous logistic regression analysis, we need to take the multinomial data frame that we have and convert it into a logical data frame. So instead of having like the factor or the variable tense with the 4 levels, present, past, future, or no tense at all, and have to convert that into 4 different variables with the values of true or false. So basically we need binary values when we're running logistic regression analysis. 3 minutes, okay, sure. So for the selection of the variables, I had to run a univariate analysis and a bivariate analysis just to make sure we find out which variables are most, are most determinative or most telling about each verb. So which ones kind of, let's say, characterize the use of each verb. And we also need to minimize the amount of correlation or co-occurrence between the different variables just to kind of avoid collinearity. And so again, I will just go over that real quick because this is the part that I'm most interested in, running the actual multivariate analysis. And so for that kind of analysis, what I tried to do is look at the outcome, and by outcome here I mean the verb, each verb. So for example, taking the come verbs, each verb of the 4 verbs would be the outcome as a proportion among all the, observed verbs within a certain context. And so this kind of goes with the hand in hand with the kind of view of language that it is probabilistic. And so language use or lexical uses are not categorical. It's either yes or no, but there's a bit of probabilistic occurrence there. So adding things to the context, removing things to the context kind of increases or decreases the chance of the occurrence of a certain lexical item. And so the variables that we have here can be interpreted as parameters, how much does the existence of one variable, contextual variable, decrease or increase, the chances of a verb occurrence. And this is the model that I picked. These are the 28 variables that I picked for my logistic regression model. And so you can see like tense, future, past, present, aspect, etc. All of these things. And eventually this is what I came up with. And let me just explain to you what I got here. For example, if we look at, let me just very quickly show you here. For the verb qadima, for example, we get for each one of these independent variables, we get a certain, the odds. And so we can interpret them as whether they increase the chances of the occurrence of qadima in a certain, altogether in the data, or they decrease it. And so if they're higher than 2, then yes, for example here, a mention of goal increases the chances of qadima to occur, but less than 1, then it decreases the chances of its occurrence. Like we have a commutative phrase like qadima ma'a, come with. And this is, just like a summary of what kind of variables are, in favor of the occurrence of the verb. Qadima prefers to appear with human subjects, with a source. Mostly qadimat jama'at, or qadima al-muslimun, or qadima, so kind of group of people, not just single human. They come qadimu ila, or qadimu likay, or qadimu, so there's always a prepositional phrase kind of added there. And then these are the odds that, if you have a verb that is used transitively in a sentence, then most likely it's not qadima. The overall accuracy of the model was pretty high, which, was good, possibly not very common when we're running logistic regression analysis, but that possibly tells us that we had too many variables there, or that, I don't know, maybe it was too specific, the model was too specific, not generalizing enough. But again, looking at, as a native speaker of language of Arabic, looking at the results that I got there, it actually made sense. We can look at the accuracy rate per verb, which is, how many times each verb that was actually observed was the one that was predicted by the model to be the one used in the context. But let me show you the more interesting stuff that I have here, which I really think is what makes this kind of tedious work really worth the time and the effort. So looking at the probability estimates here. So we can actually, by running this kind of analysis, we can zero in on what are the exemplary sentences that, or context of use for each one of these verbs. What are the context of use that are less likely for a certain verb to appear in. So for example, a context like that, الموقف الموقف الفرنسي التقليدي لصدام لم يأتي من منطق الحب له. Okay, it did not come from. So here, this kind of context really loves the verb ata, and we can see that it's almost categorical choice because we have, we have the negation, we have the subject in the third person. State, موقف, for the subject category. And so kind of the combination of all of these variables together decided that, yes, ata should be the one that should be here, and it actually was the verb that was observed. This is also another one for qadima, but I'm going to pass over that, sorry. These are very interesting ones, because you think that, okay, fine, they are inaccurate. Sometimes you look at them and they are inaccurate, but other times when I looked at these inaccurately predicted verbs, like the verb that was predicted by the model was hadara, but the actual one that was observed was qadima. Read the sentence. كان علي بن عبد الله إذا قدم مكة حاجا أو معتمرا. This is a very archaic use of language, and so the verb قدم here is being used transitively, which is kind of the domain of حضر. حضر appears most of the time. حضر مكة, حضر الاجتماع, or something like that. And so it's very telling. It shows us here that there's kind of a genre difference. That's another example here, but. Okay, sorry about that. So I'll just finish it up. There are contexts that are interchangeable, and we can see here that these contexts where, the probability estimates are almost similar is where we have actually physical motion verb, which I actually started my talk with. And so, yes, at least for the polytomous logistic regression analysis, there is a clear affinity of, contextual features towards each verb. And then we have a whole continuum, verbs that are verbs that appear in certain contexts most of the time, and then verbs that can be interchangeable, and so forth. Just to sum up with, the data frame that I'm talking about here is available if anyone wants to be, interested in kind of looking at other variable interaction. It was useful for me to look at frequency, distributional patterns, to look at, prototypical aspects of verb use, shared patterns of verb use, and then we have all these statistical tests that can actually help us zero in on the linguistic features that characterize lexical items or constructions. And I think for computational linguists, this might be a little bit, helpful, hopefully, for applications in natural language generation or breedability assessments. And so, again, you take from this presentation what you think is most useful for you, but thanks again. And if you have any questions. I would love to talk to you about that, actually, to hear about it, yes.
It's mostly with verbs and
okay. Right. Thanks. So we'll talk about that maybe.
Thank you for the presentation. I would like to know if you try to use a language model to predict the next verb, for example.
I did not do that. I looked at, the same data that was fed into the model was the data that was basically came up with the predictions. We usually do that in linguistics, in corpus linguistics, but I could have split the data in half. So have like a training data and then have it predict. The annotation was not hierarchical. It was linear, just like you said, with with that. Excel, columns with each value being specified in each column, but I could have done it in a different way as well.
Because you can just train a language model.
Exactly, yeah. That's definitely one of the applications. Absolutely, yes. Thanks.
Okay, so great, thank you.